mountains of North Carolina as a child. So it's my particular honor to serve as the juror for this year's exhibition. I approached this year's exemplary group of entries with a little bit of context. As Vicki mentioned, I was the curator of State of the Art, Discovering American Art Now, which took me to 1,000 artist studios across the country, including several here in North Carolina. And in fact, I'm seeing some familiar faces in the audience from that research some 5 years ago. Also, my recent exhibition, The Beyond, George O'Keeffe and Contemporary Art, which appeared at the North Carolina Museum of Art, took the iconic paintings of George O'Keeffe and paired them with the work of 20 contemporary artists. It's my view that the long arc of American art continues to the present day. So it's an artificial designation to say there are artists that were then and artists that are now, because there's a continuum, and we'll see some of that today. I try to stay current with the work of artists here in North Carolina, but partly because of the great tradition of art education that exists here, from Penland and its related spheres of expertise, the long history of Black Mountain College, and the vibrant and interesting contexts that make up the strong university presence in the state. Education and the arts go hand in hand here. And so it's always a treat to look at art here. Still, the experience of reviewing the hundreds, literally hundreds, I looked at hundreds of entrants into this year's competition was a thrill. And the opportunity for me to become acquainted with a whole bevy of artists who were, frankly, new to me. So a specific thank you is in order to Ann Dunn, the president of RFAS, and Vicki, the chair of this year's artist exhibition, as well as Elizabeth Purrington, Tina Whitley, and the rest of RFAS. Thank you so much, and could you just applaud with me, because they do great work. I will save my last bit of gratitude and the most important bit of gratitude for the end of my remarks, and for now, onto the art. So I open my subject today with a question. How do we know what we know? It's a deceptively complex question. And that question, how do we know what we know, is one of the central tenets of epistemology, which in the context of philosophy is basically the study of knowledge, its creation, its production, its consumption. How do we know what we know? Now, taking aside the philosophical implications, I think that the question of how do we know what we know is central to art making. Look with me at this first image that I wanted to draw your attention to. This is Robert Eoff. It's a watercolor, and it's called Foggy Morning on the name of that river is wrong. What's the correct name? Holston, thank you. I'm from Houston County in Georgia, so thus the typo. Foggy Morning on South Holston. This watercolor is imbued with the impulse to capture and know a particular place. Robert writes about his approach. He says, in the summer, if you arrive in the early morning here on the river, you share the slow drifting river with mountains, the forests, and a few other fly fishers, and a low rolling bank of fog that makes the vista seem endless. Now, it's a kind of poetic description in words that somehow doesn't stand up even to this beautiful picture, right? Robert has studied watercolors for most of his life. It shows in this work. If you take a look closely at this image when you go to the exhibition, you'll see that there is a kind of call and response, as there often is in the best watercolor, between precision and flow. The best watercolorist, as you know, many of you, because you're artists, can control the line of this really difficult medium and then allow it to fade at its most opportune moments. And I ask you to look very closely, especially in the surface of the water as it's depicted in this image, because he captures the qualities of light, refraction, and reflection in the surface of the water in a way that I think is so stunning, and calls to mind some of the greatest watercolorists of American art. People like Winslow Homer painted scenes like this in centuries past. And yet there is something contemporary about it too. If you zoom in on the figures there with the boat, you know it's a contemporary scene. So being able to capture this moment, to seek to know, right? Artists often do this. They seek to know, and they know through doing. It's true too of this beautiful photograph by Epiphany Nedler. It's easy to miss because it's hung high. When you walk into the gallery, you look up, and to your left, you'll see it. This work is called Grounds, and this kind of documentary photography is easy to walk past. You have to spend time with work like this. The way that Epiphany captures this sort of non-space in what seems to be maybe a high school, you see a logo for 4-H, there's some bleachers in the background. These are spaces that we know endemically, right? We see them, they're a part of our lives. And her skill at capturing the simplicity, the geometry of this kind of non-space calls to mind some of the best photographers of the American story, people like Eggleston, who was so good at capturing open spaces that somehow communicated a kind of an American longing. Or even, you remind me of Alex Soth. Epiphany is from the Midwest, like the great photographer Alex Soth, contemporary guy. And here you're looking at an image from around 2008. I got a lot of this sort of echoes of the history of American art as I was reviewing the images today. And it goes to show how much artists are aware, thinking and doing and reading and looking, and then those influences make their way into the art as a way of seeking knowledge. It's true too of this work, which is by Caitlin Carey, a sewn upholstery work made of repurposed upholstery fabric. It's called Nash and Edgecombe County Economic Development, which is the name of the organization that's housed in this building in Rocky Mount. And her process begins with, as she describes it, quote, meditation on a place that I know or with a visit to a place that I don't. It's almost the artistic process as a kind of observation and reflection as a means of knowing, right? And in her way of bringing together these sewn pieces of repurposed upholstery, you get both a sense of the place, but then also the fabric is used. So it brings with it a kind of story. And it leaves space in the story for us to inject ourselves. I found that incredibly beautiful. Two, there is a sense of landscape in the exhibition that you'll see that that both nods to a collective history and then also indicates a kind of specific history to the individual. What you're looking at is Irisol Gonzalez's The Condition of Latin America. Now this is a large-scale landscape, and it's if you're facing the main wall, it's on the left of the main wall. I loved this work, and it has a kind of bombast to it. It flows from left to right, from the sort of rivers and jungles of the American imaginary of Latin America, and then you see the kind of raw materials that are transformed and flowing into a more, what you might think of a North American metropolis. Irisol's approach, as she defines it, is to explore the sentiments and physical experience of being an immigrant brown woman who lives without a determined cultural identity and who is paradoxically rejected and welcomed in spaces she inhabits. So in an image like this, which is so aspirational to capture the condition of Latin America in a single image, there is this grand approach that brought to mind people like Frida Kahlo in this self-portrait along the borderline between Mexico and the United States, where she seeks to resolve these two elements of herself, her knowledge and identity. It also brought to mind in its kind of sweep and epic nature the way that Thomas Hart Benton approaches the American landscape, integrating various pieces and not really caring about traditional landscape compositional elements, right? Bringing together in a kind of collage-based aesthetic this rolling, roiling landscape that's full of possibility and meaning. And the landscape as a source for both contemporary and historical knowledge is something that you see as well in Damien Stammer's work. Many of you will be familiar with Damien's work. And I visited Damien's studio, if I remember correctly, I think his mom reminded me it was in a cracker or near a cracker factory 5 or 6 years ago. And in this particular series, which is this work is called After Lange 22, he is basically retracing the path of the great American photographer Dorothea Lange, who in 1939 was employed by the Farm Security Administration to travel in Person County, North Carolina. So finding a kind of endemic, indigenous history that can be found here, but revisiting that history in a way that's very compelling. This is a painting that's related to a photograph, right? At scale, it's blown up, right? So it both has a reference to its origin, but then he's also altering it. This mark over here on the left, this green mark, which seems to both, it could serve as like a check, like, yes, I've done it, or it could also be a kind of cancellation. Really compelling piece, and I encourage you to spend time looking at the mark making here. Here too, seeking a kind of knowledge through making, which I found quite beautiful. Now, the images that we've looked at so far have been really focused on place, on the landscape, on structures, on buildings, but of course, if you've been to the show so far, or if you're going right after this, and you should, you'll see that figures form a really central core of the objects that I chose for this show. And none are more moving to me than the two photographs by Kennedy Carter. Here, this image called Sky. You know, for a while in contemporary photography, people got, many professors were getting away from teaching portrait photography, and abstract forms of photography were becoming more the norm. And recently there's been a kind of revivification of an approach to the figure. And when I look at the two photographs in this exhibition, this and then this kind of dual portrait, East Durham Love Story, there's an intimacy here that's captured, a trust between the subject and the object of the photograph, and also a kind of a beauty, an endemic beauty that's found in the everyday. A sensitivity too to the subject. I love the way that the first thing that you look at in the photograph might be that the outline of that earring, right? That sits in the kind of the nape of her neck. And then your eye begins to rove around the image, and you start to understand this figure who's in reverie. She's in like a dreamlike state. It's almost as if she's not aware of her environment. That intimacy that she captures there was so moving to me, and it reminded me of a couple of other photographers, people like Deanna Lawson, who famously, a contemporary photographer who uplifts the Black subject in contemporary photography, capturing images of Black families within the confines of their home, but elevating them in a way into the conversation, into a new vocabulary. The intimacy, too, reminded me of someone like a Nan Goldin, right? The way that Nan Goldin was able to capture her, in the 80s, her immediate surroundings in New York City, and to communicate a kind of lived experience that was immediate and real. You felt like you had stepped into these people's lives for a moment. At its best, photography can do that, and I think Kennedy's beautiful photographs do that for us. The figure, too, holds a really fascinating story to tell in some of the other figural works in this show. I love this ceramic work by One Gutierrez called Grieving One. It's a kind of twisting figural form. It's one of the first things that you see in the gallery. The figure is covered in marks and with Swarovski crystals. She looks away from you. She has a kind of beauty to her. And the grieving of the title is left undefined. A space in the work for you to project your own understanding of grieving, to connect with perhaps your own griefs, and that space in the work for you to connect. The figure almost becomes a place to hang your hat, right? You recognize the figure, and then you come closer and you seek to know it. The way that figuration functions in this exhibition, I see that echo again and again. I love this painting construction collage kind of thing by Corey Pemberton. And it's partly because there are a number of different layers at work here. This is a pretty large scale work. It's larger than what you see on the screen. There are collaged elements of wallpaper, there's photo transfer, there are lovely moments of flattening space and then expanding it too. And you know, Corey describes this practice as giving voice to the figures included in the images, and I think that's quite right. So I want to move from figures because there's an element in this show that's about interrogating the limits of what we know through change, right? Metamorphosis, alchemy. At the hands of an artist, the raw materials of art can transform into something brand new. This is Morgan Hill's Restore Your Agency 2. This is the first thing that you see when you walk into CAM. It holds the sightline beautifully because of its scale. And it's composed of various scorched woods, resin, and magnets, which I assume affix it to the wall. Is Morgan here? I would love. Okay, great. Thank you. So in the course of making this work, Morgan describes her practice like this. She uses ritual to rid her heart and mind of intangible toxicity. What does that mean? She's burning this stuff, okay? So I imagine, you know, you think of the ritual of a bad breakup and then taking all of the photos and the stuff and the movie tickets and whatever, grabbing a big bottle of wine, heading out into the fire pit in the backyard and blazing it up, right? So the method of this work is somewhat akin to that, a kind of ritual cleansing. After the ceremony, these items are converted into symbols of guidance and empowerment. The act of making and destroying, together, making and destroying, is intrinsically linked, she says, to her own liberation and renewal. And the form of this work that it takes on the wall has a kind of uplift to it, right? It looks almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or even like some kind of a seal, like a family seal, or a medal that one might wear on a lapel. I love the way it shifts back and forth between those various meanings. And here, just a detail. Spend some time with this work and look at the surfaces because they are quite divine. Speaking of alchemy, Eric Saratella, ceramicist. This is ceramics, people, right? Okay. What is ceramics? It's dirt. It's clay, right? It comes from the earth. And there's a beautiful way that at Eric's hand, the stuff of the ground transforms into something else entirely. What you're looking at is, it's called flow. This is a functional teapot. I wish I had arrived before the vitrine went over it because I just wanted to pluck the top off of it. I wouldn't have tea with it. But here is an alternate view where it looks completely different. The sort of mimetic capacity of ceramics has been well mined. Over the long history of ceramic production, which goes back to ancient times, even prehistoric times, artists often used the capacity, the sculptural capacity of ceramics to achieve something that looks like something else. But there's something about this that's another level. This is trompe-l'oeil, right? You're fooling the eye. And his ability to transform this material into something both of our world and somehow not of it, it was so impressive to me. The transforming quality too in ceramics, you see it in Larry Moore's work. I encourage you to read his reflection in the catalog where he talks about he had been working with ceramics for quite a long time and began with a kind of one day working in his studio reflecting about Ocracoke Island. Did I say that right? Yes. Okay. And the forms of the kinds of things that you find on the beach there, right? The shells and the corals, and the way that this work with its slips and its incredible surface form makes a kind of second statement about what he finds in nature. It's so beautiful. There aren't quite words for it. Speaking of mimesis, Peter Oakley, you know, you likely know his work. He lives in Banner Elk and he transforms the highest material that we have for sculpture, right? Marble we inherited from the Greeks and Romans as the highest form of the highest material of sculpture, and Peter Oakley transforms it by hand carving things into these sort of modern machine-made icons. Here, the work is called sign plate, and you'll have to get with Peter so he can explain to you exactly what a sign plate is. There might be other people out there who can help you with that. I'm more familiar with this, a card reader. Using this kind of vaunted material of marble and then transforming it in his workshop into something else entirely, I've always been a fan of this work. You could see this kind of transformation at work too in Griffin Carrick's work. This is simple cardstock that, with a vigor and attention to material, she's transformed it into this lively, celebratory composition, which I just find so compelling. And two, I would spend some time in front of this really beautifully composed lina cut by Catherine Walker. It's called Ghost of Certaldo. And there are a few prints in this show that bear repeated viewing. This is one of them. The way that the foreground melts into the background, the highly detailed incised lines in the surface of the linoleum that's then transferred to the surface of the paper, simply stunning, and something that I was very pleased to actually see in person. I want to end on a couple of things that just made me smile. This is Susan Brabo's Caladiums. It's an oil on enamel work that is so precise you'd swear you were looking at a photograph. The level of skill here, being able to capture the craziness of this composition, right? The twisting, snaking, organic form of these leaves is, it's incredible. And her ability to transfer it, she makes it look effortless, and it was an absolute joy to look at. There's more plants in this show. This is another painting by Irisol Gonzalez called Almendro, which is a tree that's native to many Latin American countries, and so should be seen as a kind of bookend to her other landscape piece. There was a lot to see here, and in my limited remarks, I'm not able to bring up all of the images and all of the artists who moved me with their work. So I will end on a note of gratitude. Artists who are in the show and those who were not selected for this show, thank you so much for the time and attention that you put into your work. And thank you for sharing your work with me, but with us, because there's maybe never been a more difficult time to be an artist in this country. In this charged political climate, the arts, as we know, are increasingly under siege. And the more that you speak up, the more that you speak out in places like this that give you the opportunity, the better off we all are. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being here.